Well, let's get into some of the other content in the video and some of the things that are important to you.
Right.
So, in how were you doing in environmental activism before you decided to run for city council? Like, what was your involvement there?
Right. So I sit in my neighborhood council right here in Harbor South. And basically, neighborhood council system is basically it's an opportunity for local residents and neighbors to, get involved on a local level without having to, run for city council themselves. And in our district, there's a lot of like industrial activity going on and a lot of oil wells. And so I was very well aware of the pollution and the tainted air that we are forced to breathe in and endure. And so there's an opportunity for me to get involved, and that was brought by Food and Water Watch, which is an organization dedicated to pushing for environmental justice. And um, in 2019, they were pushing LADWP to pass to study a scenario where we can achieve 100% renewable energy by 2035. Because at the time, they were only looking at two scenarios, but they were both in 2045. And according to the science, from scientists all across the world, um, climate change is changing at a faster rate than we expected. So it's, 2045 is too late, right? And so I decided to get involved in pushing that, making that happen. I spoke to my neighborhood council where we passed it unanimously. I spoke to the neighborhood councils in Harbor City, in Northwest San Pedro, and in Coastal San Pedro. And in partnership with them, other community leaders, we were able to have LEDWP approve the scenario. And so now, actually, this year, they're almost done finishing their study. And so, on that level, that's how I kind of got my start in environmental activism. But I also am part of the Sunrise Movement, which is a national organization, youth-led, dedicated to passing a Green New Deal, halting climate change, and creating millions of good, paying jobs in the process. And so I've been part of the Los Angeles chapter since 2019, and through that, I've spoken at city council. I've engaged in protests. I helped out with our climate strike that we had here in LA, the biggest climate strike in Los Angeles in LA's history. I also was part of the outreach team, speaking to college students at UCLA, where I transferred to from El Camino, speaking to students at LA Trade Tech, and just really trying to grow the movement. And so that's the type of involvement I've had in regards to pushing for environmental justice.
Well, thanks for doing that. And by the way, to everyone listening, we'll point out real quick here because we noticed this in the green room. Bryant is dealing with a broken fire alarm. So you may hear that every now and again, but we wanna assure everybody everything's okay. He's fine. There's nothing is on fire. The alarm is just broken. It's not like he was like, oh, something's on fire. And I was like, well, you're doing the interview anyway, Bryant. Sit down. Sit down. It's not
Yeah,
what's
sorry
going
about
on.
that, y'all.
I don't want any. Well, I just want to make sure no one thinks that I'm like, no, you got to do the interview. Sit down, sit down. We got to get through this. Um, so yeah, but well, let's get into localized Green New Deals because I've had these conversations with people before. What is the potential for a localized Green New Deal? Not just here in Los Angeles, but just in general, like localized Green New Deals. What is the potential for them? What can be in them, and what would you try to enact when you get elected to city council?
Right. So, since it's early, I'm still doing a lot of research into this, and as I'm going over my plans, I'm also working in conjunction with community leaders, organizers, residents, and experts. But so far, as far as a Green New Deal, what does that look like for LA? It's about you're really saving our future, right? Climate change, is real as, some politicians, like to tweet out as if that's enough. But not only is it real, it's happening right here in Los Angeles. Last year we had, wildfires. Every year is always a record setting. Every year in the summer is always a record setting hot temperatures. And so it means that our city has a duty, a role, more responsibility to address this crisis at the scale and urgency required. Now, unlike many other cities in the country, what's unique about LA is that we have a publicly owned utility. Actually, it's one of the largest public owned utilities in the country. And so we have an even greater opportunity to really lead the country in transitioning to a 100% clean renewable energy economy. And
Well, what
um,
what what utility specifically are you referring to when you say that? Like,
sorry.
what are you referring to?
So the Los Angeles Department of Water and Power
Okay.
is a publicly owned utility, governed by the city of LA, and um, and so it's elected. They have a board of elected representatives, and that's what I mean by public owned utility. And so um, and so the Green New Deal is not just about halting climate change, but it's also about facilitating environmental justice, because we can transition into a green economy while also continuing the disparities in our society. And so what that means is, Black and Brown communities are disproportionately impacted by, pollution. Watts, for example, which is in our district, has a study conducted by the city showing that there's a 12-year lifespan disparity between folks in Watts and those in Brentwood, which is a more affluent neighborhood in LA County. And that's largely due to the heavy toxic waste that gets built up in Watts, is due to the heavy pollution, the lack of tree coverage. We need trees to help um, uh, clean our air. And so having a neighborhood that's as dense as Watts, but have less than 5% tree coverage, really leads to systemic, injustice there. Wilmington, which is less than 10 minutes away from here, right next to San Pedro, um, there are thousands of households who live less than half a mile away from oil wells. And these oil wells, they give off pollutants into the air that folks, children, parents, etc., breathe in, day out for years on end. And as a result, folks have short-term symptoms like watery eyes or bloody noses because of how toxic the air is. But in the long term, Wilmington residents have one of the highest rates of cancer in all of California, but also have an increased risk of having a miscarriage or asthma and many other health ailments. And so Green New Deal is not just about halting climate change, but also bringing justice to frontline communities. And then also it means creating, a lot of good jobs. The green economy is renewable energy is the fastest growing sector in the energy industry. In California, like 56% of the jobs are in the green economy, and um, and for the Green New Deal, it's really important that we make sure these jobs are union jobs, because just like we can continue transitioning to economy, we can transition to an economy where the inequities can still exist. So too can they exist in the workplace. So it's also about democratizing, the workplace by supporting workers' right to a union. My dream is to um, have the whole entire energy sector be unionized. And because we know that with a union, workers tend to have better wages, better benefits, and they can better advocate for themselves because it's as a collective, to ensure that they and their families are whole. And so have to make sure that these jobs, because workers are going to be impacted, right, by the Green New Deal, by transitioning. Um, if we really are serious about transitioning to a carbon-free economy, that means there are some jobs that won't be able to exist anymore. And so, um, the issue isn't the workers themselves who work in the fossil fuel industry, but more so, the fossil fuel executives, right, and the industry at large. And so we want to make sure that when we push for Green New Deal, we protect workers um, by providing things like apprenticeships, fully paid, providing jobs in the new economy. And so, really, the Green New Deal is a multitude of things. It's a social justice policy, it's a climate policy, and it's also a jobs program.
So, um, And you think that something like this would be well received in an area like San Pedro because first of all, it's a harbor town where nature plays a big role in
Right.
everything, and secondly, it is also a very union strong town and has been for many years. Do you think residents are eager for this type of thing?
Right. So residents are, um, yeah, I've spoken to folks like Wilmington, for example, who are well aware of, the environment. And the ports is also a heavy polluter in the city, and folks who live near the ports also have high rates of, health illnesses, and people are well aware of this. And that's why majority of residents, polled in places like Wilmington supports like a buffer zone, for example, 2,500 feet buffer zone between oil wells and families. And even right now in the city council, they're even going beyond that and pushing for phasing out oil wells altogether. Um,
Did they give a
but
timeline on that?
so last time I recall, it has to go through like two other committees, and so it's still going to take a while. And I'll be monitoring that and spreading and raising awareness on that issue. But Food and Water Watch has really been at the forefront of pushing that. But in regards to residents, so I do believe that residents do support this. I think it's just a matter of 'cause oftentimes when people hear like transition, some folks hear like job losses, and so um, I want to make sure that when we push for a Green New Deal, it's not just something that is coming from us, top down, right? But it's in collaboration with community residents, that union, that labor is involved. Because at the end of the day, unions, they have to protect their members, and so we want to make sure that we ensure that their members and their workers are safe. Because the issue is not the workers themselves; it's just the need to make sure that our economy isn't running on fossil fuels. And so if that means, making our trucks, because there's a lot of trucks active in our district, making sure that they don't emit any carbon, or making the ports more green, or and there's a variety of ways we can go about cleaning our harbor region without having to sacrifice jobs. But altogether, um, you know, majority of our residents do support this. It's just the fact. The main issue, honestly, isn't really the residents themselves, is the people in power, right? Joe Busquino isn't in support of a buffer zone, which is honestly a compromise um, solution, which is, it's the first step, right, to phasing out oil wells. And Busquino isn't even willing to support this, despite the fact that families are literally getting sick and dying as a result of, this environmental racism. And so overall, residents, I've spoken to are more than well aware of the environmental crisis, the climate calamity that we're in right now. And it's just a matter of ensuring that residents are engaged and that they're involved and that we don't leave people out of the process.
Get your news on with Ron. Don't you want to know what's going on? We're getting our news on today. Get your news on with Ron. Don't you want to know what's going on? We're getting our news on today. You can tweet me an article at Ron Placone. We'll go through it together and make it our own. Get your